The third speaker for this morning, and actually the final speaker, is Ignacio G. Galán, who is completing his PhD in the History and Theory of Architecture at Princeton University, and is currently term assistant professor in the Department of Architecture at Barnard and Columbia Colleges. He's also a practicing architect, and his work as a designer and scholar has led to the production of several publications and renowned exhibitions. Today he'll be talking about furnishing the Italian home away from home, nomad interiors for the African colonies, 1936 to 1943. So another look at a colonialist aspect of design and displacement. After this talk, we will have some time for questions and answers, a little bit of a discussion, and then we will break for lunch. I just wanted to announce that now. So please join me in welcoming then Ignacio Galán.
Thank you very much for inviting me to present my work here and for all of you here. So consider the following statement. One cannot be regarded as sensitive to the spiritual climate of our time who has not grasped the expansion of our life's horizons during the last years, an expansion which has brought us to see things that previous generations had never wondered. It seems counterintuitive to locate this argument in 1930s Italy, a context typically characterized by forms of enclosure defined by fascist politics, ranging from censorship to autarky. This period was also shaped by the commitment of designers to the furnishing of the Italian house, la casa italiana, understood both as a commonality of design features for all houses within the Italian borders and as an imaginary construction shared by the young nation. So how is one to make sense of such an expansion and the opening to things never before wondered in relation to this search for enclosure and stability? So the 1930s were the years of radicalization of fascism, especially after 1936, with the proclamation of the empire. But in this radicalization, fascism had to brace its agenda against different modernization processes, the expansion of capitalism and the development of media, which made former physical and cultural boundaries porous to the circulation of goods, people, and information. Both the domestic space of the house and the territories of the nation were destabilized by the deterritorializing forces of the modern world and its characteristic circulatory operations. These operations created, quote, a sense of existence based on adventure, according to the aforementioned statement, and modern architecture was, in this state, considered as an ally for such an adventure, one which contributed to open new ways of modern living that are utterly seductive. Moreover, one could read the mentioned expansion literally as it appealed to the larger territories occupied by the Italians due to continuous migratory flows, touristic endeavors, and more particularly to the colonial campaigns developed throughout the period. Colonization, in fact, aimed to bring together the consolidation of the Italian home with a characteristic sense of adventure, developing the tensions characteristic of the period. Interestingly, the insistence on an expansion of life horizons was particularly aimed to frame a discussion on the colonial expansion, but particularly to furniture objects and interiors. Authored by Carlo Enrico Rava, a Milanese modernist architect and designer, these words open the curatorial statement for the Mostra della Attrezzatura Coloniale, the exhibition on colonial equipment, presented in the context of the 1940 Triennale de Milano. Dedicated to the architecture of the colonies for a long time, Rava increasingly focused on the equipment accompanying the colonial expansion. The construction of architectural structures and urban settings had been key in shaping the colonial project in the period known as the definition of the empire. And it was to further this goal, but I will argue with a different emphasis, that a plethora of design objects and interiors was presented in this exhibition to furnish the entire empire's habitations. So in what follows, I will consider the relation of colonial architectures, which will concern the first part of my talk, and these furniture objects and interiors, including those in the exhibition and others that Rava designed and reviewed throughout the period. And in exploring this relationship, I want to understand the characteristics of residence within the increasingly deterritorialized context of the colonies, a context that was simultaneously defined by processes of re-territorialization. So in entering the show, visitors encounter a mirror surface supporting a number of indigenous potteries. 6 boards serve as introductory panels with their irregular outlines referencing the seemingly shapeless African regions that the exhibited objects aim to occupy. Exuberant plants throughout the show and sand covering the floor emphasize that these furniture items were not to dress conventional interiors, but rather occupy and enclose spaces in these territories. The occupied territories in Africa, which reached to include Libya, Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia in the late 1930s, remain a vague imaginary construction for the majority of the Italians. Rava had made an issue of this lack of knowledge some year earlier, highlighting some statements from his peers. Quote, "Not having enough information," said one, "Tripoli might be assimilated to Palermo," which Rava found ridiculous. Another one referenced to the, quote, "absence of local art in the tropical and subtropical Somalia," when Rava noted this was not only false, there was local art, but additionally confused the equatorial climate of the country with tropical and subtropical one. Unlike many of his peers, Rava had extensive knowledge of the colonies. His father was a general secretary for the colonies in 1929 and held office as a governor in different locations in the following years. Rava himself traveled extensively in Africa starting in the 1920s and increasingly took the colonies as the focus of his practice. With Sebastiano Larco, he famously built in the early years of his career the Pavilion for the Colonies at the Milano Fair in 1928, among others. Marcello Piacentini, an important figure in the context of architecture at the time, praised the structure as, quote, "colonial without being Arab or Turkish," demonstrating the difficult task that was assigned to the buildings in negotiating Italian identity with that of the territories occupied in the colonial expansion. This negotiation was far from univocally approached at the time. While some aimed to insert Italian architecture in the colonies to emphasize its cultural dominance, others concerned with the maintenance of local identity to emphasize difference. A 1931 memorandum by Tourist Commissioner Fulvio Sulbic, for example, was preoccupied with the perceived loss of local culture due to, quote, "the ugly constructions of European character." And yet others criticized the banal imitations of what were deemed as fake local identities. Rava's father, for example, criticized the abuse of a medieval Moorish style in Libya, writing in 1929. The search for an architecture for the colonies was a complex one, which could not be constrained to maintaining local character or assimilating the colonies within Italian identity in a totalizing view of the territories of the empire. The search for an answer to such double bind was addressed in another text signed by Mauricio Rava, yet allegedly written by Carlo Enrico, our protagonist, who expressed the need for an architecture that would be, quote, "colonial but European." Neither merely defined by its local nature or history, not as mere intrusion of foreign models, the colonial was to be defined as an idiosyncratic space in and of itself. Rava's consequent arguments focus first in evaluating the local models in the colonies. In those, he initially highlighted some buildings' response to the local climate, considering both patios and verandas as fitting response to the region. But going beyond the environmental determinism of these popular arguments, his writings also highlighted the impact of different cultural flows and diverse populations shaping the diverse colonial regions. The patio and the loggia were increasingly discussed to be simultaneously fit for their context and, quote, "intimately Italian," as they refer back to the house of classical Rome, end quote. Moreover, the existing architecture of the colonies were thus saved by Roman architecture, while its composition, particularly dialogue with the African territory, and additionally related to a, quote, "vigorous primitiveness" derived from its relation with the southern populations. Most importantly, Rava justified the value of some architectures in the colonies in relation to other flows resulting from tourism. According to him, and I quote, "tourists will certainly never stroll on the Lungomare Volpi in Tripoli, as they can find equally beautiful promenades on the Italian Riviera. Nor will they walk on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, which would only unpleasantly remind them of the main arteries in their country areas." The need for difference was highlighted here in search for an authentic colonial model. This search could be identified with the mandate that Diana Fass has suggested to shape the colonial other, and I quote, "It becomes necessary for the colonizer to subject the colonial other to a double command. Be like me. Don't be like me. Be mimetically identical. Be totally other." Significantly, Rava's valorization of the authentic nature of the architectures that interested him in the colonies put these models in relation to other architectures concerned with tourism. It is in this way that he analyzed some areas of Tripoli to be reminiscent of what others have been able to create, and I quote, "in the most celebrated resort cities of California and the Antilles, creating in such cities an exotic and colonial feel that is typical of the nature of these locations," end quote. His arguments reached to diverse territories and suggested that one place could be, quote, "exotic and colonial" as part of its nature, disregarding the contingency of both such characteristics. To be typically colonial would mean that the nature of a place is defined by the imposition of foreign cultural and social forms, which cannot be but a historical condition. Following from this evaluation of the architectures of the colonies, Rava went on to articulate a project for colonial architecture. In addressing that difficult task that he had sought for this quest, the Mediterranean became a referent linking colonial buildings to the project of modern Italian architecture. And yet, in a more personal elaboration of this program, Rava eventually returned to reference in America, highlighting the achievements of modern architectural manifestations there. Considering references ranging from Rudolf Schindler to Barragán, Rava emphasized the relationship with the American colonial tradition that he had hitherto addressed. In fact, he lamented that Italian architects had been so far unable to reach similar achievements in finding modern interpretations of Italian staples for their own colonial architecture. It is significant that in drawing this international network to situate the project of modern colonial architecture, his writings were accused of becoming, quote, "a chronicle of a mundane tourist," accusations to which he responded celebrating his cosmopolitan reach. And I quote, "It was not to my knowledge that the profession of architecture implied the prohibition to be a man of the world," end quote. The colonial space for him was not necessarily defined by local ties or constrained by relationships between the colonizer and the colonized, but more strongly linked to global circulatory networks, defining the colonial as characteristic space of the period. So it is within this context that the expansion of our life's horizons presented in Rava's exhibition of colonial attrezzatura is to be considered. Italian architects took the project of consolidating the colonial terrains at different scales, and the selection of the scale of intervention became, in and of itself, a contested terrain. The Istituto Nazionale Case Impiegati dello Stato, for example, privileged an approach based on the systematization of design knowledge of housing, with the expansion of that expertise becoming the main way in which the colonial project was to be implemented. Others pushed further the rationalization of industry as an expansionist strategy throughout the empire, with traveling prefabricated elements performing the Italian colonizing ambitions. Finally, others aimed to the rationalization of the whole territory through the means of a plan. After the occupation of Addis Ababa, Marcello Piacentini aimed to develop a proposal for a piano regolatore generale for the whole territory of the empire, though only plans like these ones in the screen were developed. Writing in 1936, Rava addressed the limitation of different partial initiatives, such as those of the Case Impiegate dello Stato, which according to him could only remain a pointless project if not adequately framed by a piano regolatore. In fact, Rava initially framed his turn to objects and furniture items as part of what he understood to be the unity of the colonial problem. Framed by this regulatory plan, in search for a unitary project such as that of Le Corbusier in Algeria that he mentioned in his writings. And yet, if we return now to the exhibition, what we see is that the objects on displays and other than concern him suggest a totally different agenda which developed the project of colonization in a distinct way. As I've already highlighted, these objects did not come to complete architectural interventions in that unitary project, but seemed to construct partial arrangements and incomplete interiors. In fact, the exhibition framed the objects on show as concerned with, quote, the nomadism of the life in the caravan, assuming that the habitation of the colonies was to be characterized by instability and transience rather than by a search for stability and completion. The works on display were in fact packable interiors, purposefully designed to move throughout the colonial territories, furnishing them as they were opened and installed in their journeys. Characteristics of the project impetus are some furniture by Salvo D'Angelo, including a suitcase that unfolds in a boudoir and another one opening to build a kitchen. Other furniture items designed and exhibited by Rava were not necessarily foldable, but an easy-to-pack kit of parts. These explorations were furthered in additional pieces in the exhibition and others that Rava reviewed for Domus in consequent months, including his own work. Others put plastic materials to respond to the need of lightness and easy maintenance, and others finally explored furnitures for diverse uses, such as this mobile for triplice uso by Mario Fabro, serving for a bedroom, a dining room, or a living room, depending on the occasion and need. So addressing these different questions, Rava argued, quote, we prefer and consider of interest particular types prepared to transport from one place to another or designed for the specific needs of the colonies. The term attrezzatura, used as Rava's exhibition framework, privileges these functional and instrumental attributes and is best translated not as furniture, but as equipment or gear, one particularly fitting for the life and movement that characterized in his mind the colonial experience. Rava's approach took on the emphasis of the term and allegedly privileged functional questions over decorative concerns. However, his explicit interest in a, quote, austere functional sense was accompanied by a preference for, quote, purity of lines and formal equilibrium, albeit justified by the possibility of developing industrial forms of serial production in a way that Rava understood to be, quote, gathering values as much as possible universal. A very canonical alignment between formal abstraction, functionality, and serial production would not suffice to understand Rava's show, and the term universal that he mobilized would require alternative avenues for evaluation. In fact, I want to argue that this gear responded to the unrooted experience that is characteristic not only of the Italian colonies, but of the larger colonial space that Rava had hitherto defined, reaching from Africa to America. This piece's aesthetic project responded to the double task assigned to them for the construction of Italians' life in the colonies, one that concerned expansion as much as enclosure, both in what Rava understood to be, quote, an acute understanding of the requirements of the climate and latitude, as much as in building, quote, an atmosphere of dignity and culture. In fact, these pieces were to prepare Italians to navigate new environments not merely understood as extreme climates or specific topographies, but as the complex cultural formations that Rava had carefully analyzed. But these objects are not necessarily endowed with either stylistic or functional features that characterize them as Italian. And in fact, Rava's analysis linked these objects to others that he reviewed from California or Hawaii, among others. In fact, these nomad interiors building the Italian home away from home were furnished as an empty signifier, seeking to absorb different meanings as they traveled the hybrid landscapes that he understood the colonies to be. But while the so-called universal condition of these pieces seemed to favor the project of expansion characteristic of the period, the dignity that Rava addressed was framed by the desire to build, quote, a hierarchical scale that is the needed base of the colonial structure in order to maintain against the indigenous people the privileges and the prestige of the dominating people's race. While this is primarily the typical language of imperial colonial Italy, it hides a more complex program for the project. What characterizes hierarchically these pieces and the home they aim to furnish is precisely their capacity to travel, setting apart the universal objects furnishing a space for Italians from what he defined as the indigenous, quote, culture of the bazaar. In fact, these objects differentiate who has access to travel, represented as movable objects in the show, and who is defined as fixed, stabilized in background paintings. Resolving the contradictions pursued for the architecture of the colonies, these objects naturalize transits as characteristic of the life of the colonies, and even more temporary habitations as distinctive of the modern period, following the definition of the colonial space as an increasingly spanning characteristic defining the period. In doing so, these objects and interiors challenge the assumed identity of the Italian house, both as a building and as the imaginary community of the nation, and at the same time they offer a particular version of the social relationships at work within the colonial project, one characterized by the possibility for some to move and the mandate for others to remain still. Thank you.